There are villages, Miss Marple had often reflected, which resemble people of good breeding and limited imagination. They keep their hedges clipped, their opinions moderate, and their difficulties behind the drawing-room door. Larkspur Hollow was such a village. It had a narrow high street with 2 respectable shops, a post office that shut for luncheon with a precision bordering on religion, and a church clock whose chime ordered the day more faithfully than conscience. One might have said, with some justice, that nothing in Larkspur Hollow ever happened by accident. The bell of St. Jude's rang 8 as Miss Marple drew back the lace curtain in the spare room of Mrs. Eleanor Fanshaw's cottage and looked out upon a lane silvered with the last of the morning mist. Across the way, Mrs. Bellamy was already sweeping her step. Farther down, a butcher's boy cycled past in a straight-backed fashion that suggested either military ambition or maternal discipline. A milk cart rattled once, turned, and stopped before the vicarage precisely as it had stopped the day before. "My dear Jane," called Mrs. Fanshawe from below, "if you don't come down this moment, the eggs will disgrace themselves entirely." Miss Marple smiled and turned away from the window. Eleanor Fanshawe had been at school with a cousin of hers 40 years ago, and had never, since that period, ceased to issue instructions in a tone both affectionate and commanding. She was a narrow woman with bright eyes, a brisk manner, and a way of pinning up her silver hair as if the least slackness might let in moral decay. When Miss Marple entered the breakfast room, the table was laid with exact neatness. Toast under a folded napkin, marmalade in a glass dish, a small vase of wallflowers, and the coffee pot set at an angle that would have satisfied a surveyor. "You are 2 minutes late," said Mrs. Fanshawe, pouring coffee. "Am I?" said Miss Marple mildly. "Then I am improving. Last year I was 5. "That was in Bournemouth, where people lose all standards." Mrs. Fanshawe sat down. Here things still mean something. Miss Marple, who knew that such pronouncements generally introduced village information, buttered a slice of toast and waited. Mrs. Fanshawe did not disappoint her. "You will have noticed," she began, "that Alfred Pennington passed the gate at exactly 7:55 this morning." Miss Marple had indeed noticed a tall, elderly gentleman with iron-grey whiskers and a dark walking coat proceeding along the lane with the air of a man personally responsible for the maintenance of time itself. "He does so every morning," Mrs. Fanshawe continued. "He walks to the end of the lane, turns at the smithy, and returns by the lower path. He enters his gate at 8:12, never 8:11, never 8:13. "A comforting habit," said Miss Marple. "It would be," said Ellen, "if he did not expect the entire village to adapt itself accordingly." Miss Marple looked interested. That look, in her case, was very slight. It consisted chiefly of becoming still. Mrs. Fanshawe leaned in a little. "Mr. Pennington was a railway inspector, you know. Yeah, retired 15 years ago. He came here after his sister died and took Ivy Bank, the red brick house with the yew hedge. He lives with a parlour-maid, a daily woman, and a niece who keeps house for him. The niece, Miss Harriet Pennington, is one of those capable women who can manage fish, flowers, and masculine tempers with equal competence. There is also a nephew who comes and goes, a charming, useless young man called Leonard." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "You see, you understand at once." Miss Marple made no reply. She had found that when one allowed people to think they had made themselves perfectly clear, they generally made themselves much clearer still. Mrs. Fanshawe took a triumphant sip of coffee. "Then there is Dr. Hale, who attends half the village and is engaged, though the matter is spoken of as if it were a constitutional weakness rather than an arrangement, to Beatrice Lyle at the clock shop. Her father repaired every clock in this district before he died, and she has taken it on. A most peculiar girl, not unpleasant, only listening always." "Clock shops do encourage that," Miss Marple observed. Mrs. Fanshawe almost smiled. "And then," she said, lowering her voice, as the maid came in with more toast, "there is Mrs. Cresswell, Pennington's neighbour, who hears far more than she ought, and repeats rather less than one would like, which makes her dangerous." The maid withdrew. Eleanor resumed. "There is to be tea at Ivy Bank this afternoon. 4:30 sharp, naturally. You are invited. Alfred admires punctuality in others because it gives him an excuse to despise them when they fail." "Then we must do our best not to disappoint him," said Miss Marple. The day moved in the smooth channels laid down for it. Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Fanshawe to the greengrocer, exchanged civilities with the vicar's wife, admired some late tulips in a garden wall, and heard 3 separate accounts of the weather, each of them offered with moral implication. By luncheon, she knew that the butcher's daughter had become secretly engaged to a man in insurance, that Miss Harriet Pennington was considered admirable, but perhaps a trifle severe, and that Leonard Pennington had lately been seen in company with a lady from Market Basing whose hats were too bright for good judgment. At 3:30, as they passed the little shop on the corner, Miss Marple paused before the display window of Lyle and Daughter, horologists. There were clocks of every description: brass carriage clocks, a walnut mantel clock with a painted moon face, a squat black alarm clock, 2 silver pocket watches, and a long-case clock mechanism displayed in pieces upon dark green velvet. Inside, behind the counter, stood Beatrice Lyle. She was younger than Miss Marple had expected, perhaps 30, perhaps a little more, with dark hair drawn smoothly back and a pale, thoughtful face. Her fingers rested lightly on the open back of a small French clock. One had the impression that she handled time with the delicacy another woman might reserve for lace. She looked up as the bell rang. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was soft, but there was an odd accuracy in it, as if she selected not merely the right word, but the right second in which to say it. Miss Marple asked on impulse whether a travelling clock she owned sometimes lost 10 minutes overnight because of damp. Beatrice listened with serious attention. "It might," she said, "though clocks often misbehave because someone wants them to say something they cannot." Miss Marple glanced at her. "That sounds rather sad." Beatrice's mouth moved very slightly, not quite a smile. "Most things about time are," she replied. When they left the shop, Mrs. Fanshawe said at once, "Well, she is intelligent," said Miss Marple. "That is always inconvenient in a village girl." At 4:25 they approached Ivy Bank. It was a sober red brick house set back from the road behind a clipped yew hedge, and a gate painted black with almost military severity. The gravel path ran straight to the front door. The windows were clean enough to suggest inspection. On the hall table within, visible even from the step, stood a tall brass clock beneath a glass dome. "I feel," murmured Miss Marple, "as though we are arriving at headquarters." Mrs. Fanshawe sniffed. Harriet Pennington opened the door before they had fully rung. She was a woman in her early 40s, handsome in a firm-featured way, with chestnut hair parted plainly and a composed expression that seemed born of long practice rather than natural calm. "How good of you to come," she said. "Uncle Alfred is in the drawing room. We're exactly on time." "That must be a relief," said Mrs. Fanshawe. If Harriet noticed the dryness of the remark, she gave no sign. She led them in. Mr. Alfred Pennington stood by the mantelpiece, one hand behind his back, the other holding a watch on a chain. He was tall, spare and upright, with an angular face and deep-set eyes. His black coat looked as though it had been brushed not merely this morning, but perhaps every morning of its existence. He bowed to Miss Marple with old-fashioned correctness. "Mrs. Fanshawe, Miss Marple, you're punctual, a rare virtue." "I have always found it wise," said Miss Marple, taking the chair indicated, "not to quarrel with clocks when one is in their own house." For the first time, a faint expression crossed Mr. Pennington's face. It might in another man have been amusement. Tea was brought in by a parlour-maid whose cap sat a little crookedly, suggesting either haste or tears. Harriet poured. Mr. Pennington presided. The cups were thin china, and the bread and butter cut with mathematical precision. Conversation moved through the usual safe territories, gardens, weather, an upcoming church bazaar, until the door opened and a young man came in without announcement. Leonard Pennington was good-looking in the way weak men often are. Fair hair, easy smile, charming eyes with uncertainty behind them. He stopped when he saw the company. "Sorry," he said lightly. "Didn't realise it was a full tribunal." "Then you should have looked at the hall clock," said his uncle. Leonard's smile flickered, then returned. "I was delayed." "You are always delayed." Harriet intervened at once. "Leonard, will you have tea?" "If there is any left after justice has been served." He bent over Harriet's hand with a grace that seemed half affectionate, half theatrical, and took a place near the window. Miss Marple noticed that he did not look at his uncle again. Nor did Alfred Pennington look at him, which was perhaps more telling. A quarter of an hour later, another caller was announced. Dr. Stephen Hale, broad-shouldered, fair and reassuring, with the pleasant directness of a man much liked by women and trusted by old people. He had come, he said, to see Mr. Pennington about some subscription list for the hospital fund. Mr. Pennington frowned. "You are 3 minutes earlier than arranged." Dr. Hale laughed. "Then put it down as preventive medicine." There was a little stir of polite amusement. Only Beatrice Lyle, who had entered quietly behind him with a parcel of repaired watch straps for Harriet, did not laugh. She stood near the door for a moment, still as a figure in a painted panel, her eyes moving from the doctor to the clock on the mantel. Then, very softly, as if to herself, she said, "Sometimes 3 minutes make all the difference." No one answered, yet Miss Marple, glancing round the room, had the sudden curious feeling that a remark entirely innocent on the surface had fallen among them like a pin dropped in still water. The ripples, she thought, might not show at once. And when she looked toward Alfred Pennington, she saw that his hand had gone, almost involuntarily, to the watch in his pocket. The gathering at Ivy Bank lingered a little longer than such gatherings usually did. There was something, Miss Marple could not have said precisely what, that held the room in a delicate tension. It was not unpleasant. No voices were raised, no glances openly hostile. Yet beneath the careful politeness, there was the faintest sense of adjustment, as though each person present were measuring themselves against an invisible standard. Time, Miss Marple thought, was not merely kept in this house, it was observed. When Beatrice Lyle stepped forward to hand Harriet the small parcel, her movements were quiet, almost precise to the point of invisibility. Harriet thanked her with composed warmth. "You're very kind to bring it yourself." "It was ready," Beatrice replied, "and I was passing." Miss Marple noticed that this was not true. The shop was in the opposite direction. Dr. Hale turned with easy familiarity. "You'll stay for tea, Miss Lyle?" Beatrice hesitated, only for a fraction, but it was enough for Miss Marple to see that her answer mattered. "If I am not in the way—" "You're never in the way," said Dr. Hale lightly. "Mr." Pennington cleared his throat. "Provided," he said, "that one understands the importance of not disturbing arrangements already made." Beatrice inclined her head. "Of course." She took the chair farthest from him. Leonard, from his place near the window, watched the exchange with faint amusement. His foot tapped once against the carpet, an unconscious, restless motion. "Uncle," he said suddenly, "you might allow that not everything in life can be arranged to the minute." Mr. Pennington did not turn. "That is precisely where you're mistaken." Harriet intervened again, smoothly. "Leonard has been helping at the estate office," she said. "He has had to keep irregular hours." "Then the fault is not in the hours," said Mr. Pennington, "but in the keeping of them." Leonard laughed. "You see, Miss Marple, a man may be judged by a watch he does not even own." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "In my experience," she said gently, "people are seldom judged by the thing itself, but by what it suggests." Leonard looked at her with sudden interest, as if she had said something more than appeared. "Well," he said, "that sounds ominous enough." Dr. Hale, sensing perhaps that the conversation edged toward discomfort, rose and moved toward the mantel. "This clock," he said, tapping the glass dome lightly, "has always fascinated me. It never seems to vary." "It does not," said Mr. Pennington sharply. "It is regulated every Sunday." "By you?" asked Miss Marple. "By Miss Lyle," Harriet replied. "She attends to all our clocks." Beatrice looked up. "It is not difficult," she said. "Only a matter of attention." Miss Marple smiled at her. Attention is rarely so simple as it sounds." For a moment Beatrice met her gaze. There was something there. Not defiance, not quite secrecy, but a kind of quiet resistance, as though she were accustomed to seeing more than she chose to say. The tea ended at precisely 5:10, not 5:09, not 5:11. Mr. Pennington rose. "I walk at 5:15, he announced. "The light is best at that hour." Harriet stood at once. "I will see our guests out." Leonard remained where he was, lounging back with studied indifference. "Don't let the light escape you," he murmured. Mr. Pennington paused in the doorway. "It never has," he said. The front gate closed behind Miss Marple and Mrs. Fanshawe with a decisive click. "Well," said Eleanor, drawing her shawl more tightly about her shoulders, "if that is not the most oppressive atmosphere I have endured in months." "My dear Eleanor," said Miss Marple mildly, "you say that about every tea party where the sandwiches are properly cut. This is quite different. There is something wrong there." "Yes," said Miss Marple. She did not elaborate. They walked in silence for a few moments. The evening had softened. A pale gold light lay across the hedgerows, and the air carried the faint scent of damp earth and distant smoke. "Did you notice the maid?" Mrs. Fanshawe said suddenly. "Her cap was crooked." "Yes. She has been crying. I should not wonder if Mr. Pennington has been correcting her." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Or perhaps she has something of her own to cry about." Eleanor gave a short sniff. Servants always have something to cry about. It is practically their profession. Miss Marple did not reply. She was thinking of the way the girl's hands had trembled as she set down the tray, and of the way she had glanced, not at Mr. Pennington, but at the clock. At the corner, they parted from Dr. Hale, who had caught up with them. "Walking off the cake," he said cheerfully. "Miss Marple, I hope you are enjoying your visit." "Very much." "Larkspur Hollow is a quiet place," he added. "Nothing much to disturb one." "Quiet places," said Miss Marple, "are often the most observant." He laughed. "That sounds like a warning." "Only a reflection." He hesitated, then said, lowering his voice slightly, "You will forgive me if I say, Harriet worries too much about her uncle. He's not an easy man, but he means no harm." "No," said Miss Marple. Dr. Hale frowned faintly. "He is exacting, but not unkind." "Exactness can sometimes feel like unkindness," Miss Marple observed. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I suppose it can." He took his leave at the next turning. Mrs. Fanshawe watched him go. "A good man," she declared. "Though I do not approve of engagements that take so long to settle. It suggests hesitation." "Or consideration," said Miss Marple, "which amounts to the same thing." They reached the cottage just as the church clock struck 6. Miss Marple paused at the gate. The sound seemed for some reason louder than it had that morning, each note clear, measured, final. 6. 6. 6. She stood quite still until the last echo faded. "My dear Jane?" said Mrs. Fanshawe. Miss Marple turned. "Only a thought," she said. "What sort of thought?" "That if one were to choose a time for something important," Miss Marple said slowly, "one would choose a time that no one could mistake." Mrs. Fanshawe looked puzzled. "I do not follow you at all." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "No," she said. "Not yet." That evening passed without incident. Supper was eaten, letters written, a little knitting accomplished. At 9, Mrs. Fanshawe retired, declaring that early hours preserved both complexion and judgment. Miss Marple remained in the sitting room a little longer. The fire had burned low. The small clock on the mantel ticked softly. Outside, the village had settled into its habitual stillness, broken only by the occasional distant bark of a dog or the rustle of wind in the hedge. Miss Marple's needles moved with gentle precision. Time, she thought, was like knitting in some ways. One stitch followed another in an orderly fashion. A pattern emerged, if one cared to see it, but a single dropped stitch, so small, so easily overlooked, could alter everything that came after. She was considering this when there came a sudden sharp sound from somewhere down the lane. A door perhaps slammed with more force than necessary. Miss Marple's hands paused. She listened. Nothing followed. No voices, no footsteps. Only the quiet returning like water after a stone is thrown. After a moment she resumed her knitting. At precisely 10 she rose, wound the clock and went upstairs. In the darkness the village lay as it always did. Orderly, contained, predictable. But just before she fell asleep, Miss Marple had the distinct impression that something had shifted. Not visibly, not yet, but somewhere, within the careful machinery of Larkspur Hollow, a wheel had moved out of place, and when such things happened, she knew it was only a matter of time before the mechanism failed. She did not yet know how soon that failure would come, but in a house where every minute was accounted for, it would not come late. Miss Marple woke early the next morning, as was her habit, though for a few moments she lay still listening. There is a difference, she had often thought, between the quiet of a place that sleeps peacefully and the quiet of a place that is waiting. Larkspur Hollow, on this particular morning, seemed to possess the latter quality. The silence felt thinner somehow, as though it might easily be broken. Then, quite suddenly it was. The church bell rang, once, twice, 3 times. Not the measured orderly peal of the hour, but a hurried irregular summoning, sharp, urgent, unmistakable. Miss Marple sat up at once. Below she heard Mrs. Fanshawe's door open, followed by brisk footsteps along the passage. "Jane! Jane! Are you awake?" "I am." Miss Marple called calmly, already reaching for her dressing gown. "Something has happened." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "I think it has." By the time she came downstairs, the front door stood open, and Mrs. Fanshawe was speaking in low, rapid tones to Mrs. Bellamy from across the lane. "No, I do not know exactly. Only that the boy from the post office was sent running, and Dr. Hale has been fetched, and they say—" "They say what?" asked Miss Marple, appearing behind her. Both women turned. Mrs. Bellamy lowered her voice further, though there was no one near enough to overhear. "It's Mr. Pennington," she said. "They found him. Dead." Mrs. Fanshawe gave a sharp exclamation. "Dead? But we only saw him yesterday afternoon." Mrs. Bellamy nodded, her eyes bright with that curious mixture of shock and interest which tragedy so often produced. "In his study. Just after 6, they say. Harriet went in to call him for dinner, and there he was, in his chair, like he'd just stopped." Miss Marple did not speak. "Dr. Hale is there now," Mrs. Bellamy continued. "They've sent for the constable as well, though I don't know why. Everyone says it was his heart. He's not a young man, after all." "No," said Miss Marple. Her voice was very quiet. Mrs. Fanshawe clutched at her shawl. "Come, Jane," she said. "We must go at once." "I do not think," Miss Marple replied gently, "that we should be of much assistance just now. But we should only add to the confusion. It is better to wait." Mrs. Fanshawe hesitated, torn between curiosity and propriety. Yes, perhaps you're right," she said reluctantly. But the waiting was not easy. The morning, which had begun with such peaceful promise, now unfolded in fragments of rumour and half-confirmed detail. People passed along the lane more frequently than usual, stopping to exchange information, each account slightly different from the last. He had been found at precisely 6:15. No, 6:20. No, exactly 6:15 because Harriet had looked at the clock. He had been sitting in his chair, fully dressed. There was a glass on the table beside him. No glass, only his papers. Miss Marple listened to it all with patient attention, separating the certain from the speculative with the quiet efficiency of long practice. By 9:30, Doctor. Hale himself came to the cottage. He looked tired, though the day had barely begun. Mrs. Fanshawe, Miss Marple. "Doctor," said Eleanor eagerly, "is it true? Mr. Pennington?" "Yes," he said. "I'm afraid so." "A heart attack?" she pressed. Dr. Hale hesitated. "It appears so." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him. "Appears," she repeated softly. He met her gaze, then looked away. "There is no sign of anything else," he said. He was seated in his chair. No disturbance, no indication of struggle. "But," said Miss Marple, he gave a faint rueful smile. "You have a way of hearing what is not said. It is a useful habit," he sighed. "It is only—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The timing is curious." "In what way?" "He was seen walking in the garden at exactly 5:40. Harriet spoke to him then. He returned to his study shortly after. At 6:15 she went in to call him and found him as he was." "That is not a long interval," said Miss Marple. "No. And you are certain of the time?" "Harriet is. She's very particular." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "And the clocks?" she asked. "The clocks?" "Yes, in the study." Dr. Hale frowned faintly. "I believe they were in order. The mantel clock was running." "Precisely?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated again. "I did not check it myself." Mrs. Fanshawe gave a small, impatient sound. "Surely, Jane, it cannot matter whether the clock was a minute fast or slow. The man is dead." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "He is." She turned back to Dr. Hale. "And Miss Lyle?" she asked us. "Has she been told?" "Yes. She came this morning. Harriet sent for her to look at the clocks. Oddly enough." "Oddly?" Miss Marple repeated. Dr. Hale shrugged. "Well, it seemed a strange thing to think of at such a moment." "Not necessarily," said Miss Marple. "If one believes that time is important, one might wish to be certain of it." He looked at her thoughtfully. "There is something else," he said. "Yes?" "The parlour-maid, the girl who was serving tea yesterday, has been very upset. More than one would expect." "In what way?" "She insists that something is wrong, that it is not natural." Mrs. Fanshawe sniffed. "Servants are always imagining things." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "or perhaps she's noticed something others have not." Dr. Hale nodded slowly. "That is what I thought. I have asked the constable to speak with her." Miss Marple rose. "I wonder," she said, "whether I might call at Ivy Bank later today." "Doctor." Hale looked surprised. "You think there is something to be discovered?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that when things are too exact, it is wise to look very closely at them." He considered this, then inclined his head. "I will tell Harriet to expect you." After he'd gone, Mrs. Fanshawe turned to Miss Marple with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "You do not mean, Jane, you cannot possibly think—" "I do not think anything," said Miss Marple. "Not yet." "But you suspect—" "I observe," Miss Marple corrected her, "and at present I observe that a man who lived by the clock has died at a time that fits his habits rather too perfectly." She moved to the window and looked out at the quiet lane. "In my experience," she added softly, "perfection is seldom as natural as it appears." Mrs. Fanshawe shivered slightly. "It is most uncomfortable the way you say things." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "it often is." By the time they set out for Ivy Bank that afternoon, the village had settled into a subdued, expectant hush. Curtains twitched as they passed. Doors opened a fraction, then closed again. At the gate, Miss Marple paused. The house looked exactly as it had the day before, orderly, composed, unchanged. Only the black ribbon tied to the brass knocker suggested otherwise. Harriet admitted them. She was pale but perfectly controlled. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Uncle Alfred would have appreciated punctuality, even now." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am very sorry for your loss." "Thank you," her voice did not tremble. "Doctor." "Hale said you wished to see the study. If it would not trouble you." "Not at all." She led them down the narrow passage. The study door stood open. Miss Marple stepped inside. The room was neat, almost austere. A large desk stood near the window, papers arranged in precise stacks. A bookshelf lined one wall. The mantel clock ticked steadily beneath its glass dome, and in the high-backed chair by the desk, there was the empty space where Alfred Pennington had died. Miss Marple stood very still. Then slowly she crossed the room. Her eyes moved, not hurriedly, but with quiet, deliberate care, from the desk to the chair to the clock. Everything, at first glance, was exactly as it should be, which, she thought, was precisely the difficulty. Because somewhere in that perfect arrangement, something was not. The study at Ivy Bank held its order too carefully. Miss Marple did not at once approach the chair. Instead, she paused just inside the doorway, as though unwilling to disturb the arrangement of the room. Harriet stood behind her, composed but watchful, while Mrs. Fanshawe hovered with an expression of solemn curiosity she made little attempt to disguise. "It has not been altered," Harriet said. "Dr. Hale advised that everything remain as it was until the constable had seen it." "A wise precaution," Miss Marple replied gently. She moved forward at last. The chair was positioned at a slight angle to the desk, as if its occupant had turned a little to reach for something, or perhaps to consider a thought. The arms were polished from long use. There was no sign of disturbance, no displacement of objects, no mark upon the carpet. Miss Marple rested her fingertips lightly on the back of the chair, then withdrew them almost at once, as though the contact had told her more than she wished to admit. "And he was found here?" she asked. "Yes," said Harriet, "exactly there." "At 6:15? "Yes." Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "You're certain of the time?" "I looked at the clock," Harriet said. "The one on the mantel." Miss Marple followed her gaze. The clock stood beneath its glass dome, its brass face gleaming softly in the muted afternoon light. The hands moved with steady, unhurried precision. "May I?" Miss Marple asked. Harriet inclined her head. Miss Marple stepped closer, bending just enough to bring the dial level with her eyes. She did not touch it. She merely looked. How often is it wound?" "Every Sunday morning. And regulated?" "Whenever Miss Lyle attends to it." Miss Marple nodded. "Yesterday," she said. "Miss Lyle mentioned that sometimes 3 minutes may make all the difference." Harriet gave a faint, almost impatient movement. "I do not see how that applies here. The clock is accurate." "Of course." Miss Marple straightened and turned her attention to the desk. The papers were arranged in small, orderly piles. A ledger lay open, its columns filled with neat, exact figures. Beside it stood an inkstand. A pen placed precisely across it, as though aligned by rule. There was also, Miss Marple noticed, a small glass. It was clean. Too clean. "Was this here?" she asked, indicating it. Harriet came forward. "Yes. Our Uncle Alfred had a habit of taking a small glass of tonic at 5:30. And yesterday, he did the same. Who brought it to him? The parlour-maid, Emily." Miss Marple's eyes flickered very slightly. "I should like to speak with her if I may." Harriet hesitated. "She's rather distressed." "That is understandable. I will send for her." She left the room quietly. Mrs. Fanshawe drew closer at once. "Well?" she whispered. "What do you make of it?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she moved to the window. The garden lay beyond, trim, measured, perfectly kept. The path ran straight along the lawn, bordered by flower beds that showed no sign of neglect. At the far end, the yew hedge stood dark and impenetrable. "A man who lives like this," Miss Marple said at last, "does not leave things to chance." "No," said Mrs. Fanshawe, "certainly not." "And yet," Miss Marple continued softly, "chance is often the explanation most readily accepted." Mrs. Fanshawe frowned. "I do wish you would be clearer, Jane." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "So do I," she said. The door opened, and Harriet returned with the parlour-maid. Emily was a slight girl of perhaps 19, with fair hair that had come loose at the temples and eyes red from recent tears. Her hands twisted together as she stood just inside the room. "You wish to speak with me, miss?" she said. Miss Marple's voice, when she replied, was very gentle. "Yes, my dear. Only for a moment. There is nothing to be afraid of." Emily nodded, though her fingers continued to move restlessly. "You brought Mr. Pennington his tonic yesterday afternoon?" "Yes, miss. At 5:30. Oh, same as always." "And he was well then?" "Oh yes, miss, quite well." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "Did you remain in the room?" "No, miss. I put the tray down and went out." "Did he say anything to you?" Emily hesitated. Only that I was late." Mrs. Fanshawe made a small sound of disapproval. "Were you?" Miss Marple asked. "By a minute, miss, maybe 2. "And that upset him?" Emily gave a small, miserable nod. "He said I must learn to respect the clock." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Yes," she said quietly. "I imagine he would." She paused, then added, "Did you notice anything else?" Emily looked down. "No, miss. Only—" She stopped. Miss Marple did not press her at once. "Only what?" she said after a moment. Emily swallowed. "The clock, miss." "The clock? It—" The girl faltered. "It didn't seem right." "In what way?" "I don't know, miss. Only, when I came in, it said 5:30, and when I went out—" She shook her head. It felt as though it had hardly moved at all. Mrs. Fanshawe gave an impatient sigh. "My dear child, clocks do not leap about simply because one is flustered." "I know that, ma'am," Emily said, her voice trembling. "But it just seemed wrong." Miss Marple spoke again, very softly. "And later, when Miss Harriet found him?" "I wasn't there, miss. I was in the kitchen." "But you heard?" "Yes, miss," Miss Harriet called out, "and when I came—" She broke off, pressing her hands together more tightly. "It's not natural," she whispered. "It can't be." Miss Marple stepped closer. "What makes you say that?" Emily looked up, her eyes wide and frightened. "Because everything was just the same, miss. Just the same as always." Miss Marple regarded her for a long moment. "Yes," she said at last. "I understand." Harriet moved forward. "That will be all, Emily." The girl left quickly, as though glad to escape. Mrs. Fanshawe shook her head. "Imagination," she said firmly, "nothing more." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. She turned once more to the desk, the glass, the papers, the pen, all precisely as they should be. And yet, she moved her hand slowly across the surface of the desk, not touching, only tracing the air above it. "Miss Harriet," she said, "when you found your uncle, did you touch anything?" "No, nothing at all." "I went to him, of course. I thought he had fainted. But when I saw—" She stopped, then continued more steadily. "I rang for Dr. Hale at once." "And the clock?" Miss Marple asked. Harriet frowned slightly. "I did not think of it." "No," said Miss Marple, "one would not." She turned away from the desk. "Thank you," she said. "You have been very helpful." Harriet inclined her head. "If there is anything else, I will let you know." They left the study together. In the hall, the tall brass clock under its glass dome ticked with measured certainty. Miss Marple paused before it. "Do you wind this yourself?" she asked. "Yes," Harriet replied. "Every evening." "At a particular time?" "Of course," Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course." As they stepped out into the late afternoon light, Mrs. Fanshawe drew a long breath. "Well," she said, "I can see nothing at all to suggest anything other than a natural death." "No," said Miss Marple, "well, nothing at all." They walked in silence for a few moments. Then Miss Marple spoke again. "My dear Eleanor, have you ever known a household in which everything runs perfectly?" Mrs. Fanshawe considered. "No," she said. "There is always something." "Quite so." Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly on the windows of Ivy Bank. "And when there is not," she added quietly, "one must ask why." Mrs. Fanshawe gave her a sharp look. "You're thinking something, Jane?" "Yes." "What?" Miss Marple smiled. "I am thinking," she said, "that Mr. Pennington's life was arranged to the minute." "Well?" "And that his death," she went on softly, "appears to have been arranged in exactly the same way." Mrs. Fanshawe stopped short. "You cannot mean—" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she listened. Somewhere in the distance a clock struck the hour, clear, precise, certain. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "Time," she said, almost to herself, "can be kept, or it can be used," she resumed walking. "And in this case," she added, "I begin to suspect it has been used very cleverly indeed." That evening, Larkspur Hollow did not settle into its usual calm. There was a hush, certainly, but not the comfortable kind. Doors closed more firmly than usual. Lamps were lit a little earlier. Conversations, when they occurred, were held in lower tones, as though the very air might carry them farther than intended. Miss Marple, seated by the fire in Mrs. Fanshawe's sitting room, continued her knitting with the same gentle precision as before, yet her thoughts were anything but orderly. Mrs. Fanshawe, by contrast, was in a state of contained agitation. "I cannot like it, Jane," she said for perhaps the fourth time. "I cannot like it at all." "My dear Eleanor," Miss Marple replied mildly, "one is not required to like unfortunate events. That is not what I mean. I mean the feeling of it. The girl's talk, the doctor's hesitation, your manner." She broke off. "It suggests something unpleasant." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Well, what?" Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Let us consider," she said quietly, "what we know." Mrs. Fanshawe leaned forward at once. "Mr. Pennington," Miss Marple continued, "lived a life governed by exact habits. He took his tonic at 5:30. He was seen in the garden at 5:40. He returned to his study shortly thereafter. At 6:15 he was found dead." "Yes," said Mrs. Fanshawe. "Perfectly clear." "Perfectly," Miss Marple echoed. She paused. "Too perfectly, perhaps." Mrs. Fanshawe frowned. "I do not see how that can be a fault." "No," said Miss Marple. "Most people would not." She resumed her knitting, though her needles moved more slowly now. "The difficulty," she went on, "is that life is rarely so accommodating. People forget things. They are delayed. They misjudge the time. Even the most punctual person is subject to small variations. Mr. Pennington was not." "No," said Miss Marple, "and that is precisely what makes the situation interesting." Mrs. Fanshawe gave a small, impatient sound. "You are being obscure again." "Am I? Then let me be clearer." Miss Marple looked up. "If Mr. Pennington died naturally, one would expect the circumstances to reflect the ordinary irregularities of life. And they do not." "They reflect," said Miss Marple softly, "an arrangement." Mrs. Fanshawe stared at her. "You mean someone arranged his death?" "I do not yet say that," Miss Marple replied. "Only that the timing of it has been presented to us in a particular way." Before Mrs. Fanshawe could respond, there came a knock at the door. It was Dr. Hale. He entered with a certain gravity, removing his hat as he did so. "I hope I am not intruding." "Not at all," said Mrs. Fanshawe quickly. "We were just discussing, well, everything." Dr. Hale gave a faint, weary smile. "Yes, the village is doing much the same." He turned to Miss Marple. "I thought you might wish to know. There will be an inquest," Mrs. Fanshawe gasped. "An inquest? But surely—" "It is only a formality," he said. "Given the circumstances, it is considered advisable." "Circumstances?" Miss Marple asked. Dr. Hale hesitated. "There are small inconsistencies." "Such as?" He glanced at Mrs. Fanshawe, then back at Miss Marple. "The time," he said. "It does not quite align." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained composed. "In what way?" "The clock in the study," he said slowly, "is 3 minutes fast." Mrs. Fanshawe made a dismissive gesture. 3 minutes! That is nothing." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "It is not nothing." Dr. Hale nodded. "It would not matter, except that Harriet is certain of the time she entered the room. She had just checked the hall clock, which is correct." Miss Marple was very still. "And the difference between the two clocks is exactly 3 minutes?" "Yes." "Consistently?" "Yes." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "I see." Mrs. Fanshawe looked from one to the other. "I do not see," she said. "What possible difference can 3 minutes make?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "My dear Eleanor," she said, "it can make all the difference in the world." Dr. Hale watched her thoughtfully. "You think it significant?" "I think it intentional," Miss Marple replied. There was a brief silence. "You mean," said Dr. Hale slowly, "that someone altered the clock?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple. "Or perhaps it was always so, and only now do we notice it." "But why?" Mrs. Fanshawe demanded. "Why should anyone care whether a clock is 3 minutes fast?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because," she said, "if one wished to establish a precise time for an event, one might find it convenient to adjust the instrument by which that time is measured." Dr. Hale drew in a breath. "You're suggesting that the time of death may not be what it appears." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that we should not accept it without question." "Mrs. Fanshawe sank back in her chair. "This is most disturbing." "Yes," said Miss Marple, it is." Dr. Hale rose after a few moments. "I must return," he said. "There are arrangements to be made." He hesitated, then added, "Miss Marple, if you have any thoughts—" "I will share them," she said. He nodded and left. The door closed behind him. For a long moment neither woman spoke. Then Mrs. Fanshawe said in a low voice, "Jane, you do think it was murder, don't you?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she rose and went to the mantel where the small clock ticked quietly. She adjusted it, very slightly. "Clocks," she said almost to herself, "are such reliable things. One trusts them without question." She turned back. "And that," she added, "is what makes them so very useful." Mrs. Fanshawe shivered. "I do not like it," she repeated. "No," said Miss Marple, "and nor do I." The next morning brought a pale, uncertain light, and with it the arrival of the village constable, a solid, methodical man named Briggs, who took his duties seriously without ever quite understanding why they should be necessary in a place like Larkspur Hollow. Miss Marple encountered him at Ivy Bank, where she had gone again at Harriet's request. "Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap, "I understand you were among the last to see the deceased." "That is so." "And you observed nothing unusual?" Miss Marple considered. "Nothing," she said, "that would have appeared unusual at the time." He nodded, satisfied. "That is what everyone says." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "it often is." Inside, the house felt different. Not disordered, never that, but altered. The precise rhythm of it had been disturbed. Doors stood open that would normally be closed. Voices carried in ways they had not before. Harriet received her in the drawing room. "I am glad you have come," she said. "There are matters I do not quite understand." "Such as?" Harriet hesitated. "The clocks," she said. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. "Yes?" "I have checked them all, every one in the house, and they are not in agreement." "In what way?" "The study clock is fast, the hall clock is correct. The clock in Uncle Alfred's bedroom is slow." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And this is unusual?" "Very. Miss Lyle attends to them regularly. They are never out of step." Miss Marple was silent for a moment. "Miss Harriet," she said at last, "may I ask, who had access to the study yesterday afternoon?" Harriet frowned slightly. "No one. As far as I know, Uncle Alfred was there. Emily went in with the tray. Leonard may have passed through the hall. Dr. Hale arrived later, and Miss Lyle came with the parcel." Miss Marple inclined her head. "A small number of people," she said. "Yes." "And all," she added softly, "with perfectly good reasons to be there?" Harriet looked at her sharply. "You think—" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that we must consider every possibility." She moved to the window. Outside, the garden lay as before, orderly, composed, untouched. And yet, somewhere within that careful arrangement, something had been altered. Something small, something easily overlooked. Something that had shifted the time of a man's death by 3 minutes. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the path. 3 minutes, she murmured. Such a little thing, and yet, she thought, it was enough to change everything. Miss Marple left Ivy Bank with a curious sense of quiet urgency. It was not alarm, she had known far too many such situations to feel that, but rather the distinct impression that the pieces of the pattern were already present. Only their arrangement remained uncertain, and as with knitting, once the pattern revealed itself, it could not be unseen. She did not return directly to Mrs. Fanshaw's cottage. Instead, she turned toward the corner of the high street and made her way to Lyle and Daughter Horologists. The bell above the door gave a small, precise chime as she entered. Inside, the air held that faint, unmistakable scent of oil and polished brass. Clocks lined the walls in quiet ranks, each one ticking, each one marking time in its own steady fashion. Yet there was no confusion in the sound. It was, rather, a layered harmony. Miss Marple stood for a moment listening. Then she said, "Good afternoon." Beatrice Lyle looked up from the workbench. "Miss Marple?" There was no surprise in her tone, only recognition. "I wondered if you might come," she added. "Did you?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That suggests a certain foresight." Beatrice's fingers rested lightly on a small watch she had been adjusting. "Not foresight," she said. "Only attention." Miss Marple moved closer, her gaze drifting over the tools laid out with careful order. "Your work must require a great deal of it." "It does. And a steady hand." "Yes." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And accuracy." Beatrice met her eyes. "Yes," she said again. There was a brief pause. Then Miss Marple said quite simply, "The clocks at Ivy Bank are not in agreement." Beatrice did not look away. "No," she said. "You are aware of that?" "Yes." Miss Marple studied her. "That is unusual, I believe." "It is," Beatrice replied. "And yet," Miss Marple continued gently, "you have not corrected them." "No. Why not?" Beatrice hesitated. It was not a long hesitation, but it was real. "Because," she said at last, "I wish to see who would notice." Miss Marple's expression did not change. "And who has?" "You have." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I have." She glanced toward the row of clocks along the wall. "Tell me," she said, "how easy would it be to alter a clock by 3 minutes?" Beatrice's fingers moved slightly over the watch in her hand. Very easy." "And to ensure that it remained so?" "Also easy." "And to adjust several clocks differently?" Beatrice gave a faint, almost ironic smile. "That would be easier still." Miss Marple nodded. "I see." She was silent for a moment, then said, "You were at Ivy Bank yesterday afternoon?" "Yes." "At what time?" "A little before 5. "And you left?" "At 5:10. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her. "That is a very exact memory." "I keep time," Beatrice said simply. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "you do." She moved slowly along the counter, her gaze thoughtful. "And when you were there, did you notice anything unusual?" Beatrice's expression did not change. "No." Miss Marple stopped. "No," she repeated softly. "No." There was something in the way she said it. Not false, not quite, but incomplete. Miss Marple did not press her. Instead, and she said, "Dr. Hale was present yesterday as well." "Yes." "You know him well?" Beatrice's hand stilled. "Well enough." "And Miss Harriet?" "She is capable." "And Mr. Leonard Pennington?" A flicker, very slight, passed across Beatrice's face. "He is careless." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That is a kind description." Beatrice did not respond. Miss Marple turned back toward her. "My dear Miss Lyle," she said gently, "you have chosen not to correct the clocks." "Yes." "And you wish to see who would notice." "Yes." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Why?" For the first time, Beatrice looked away. "To see," she said, "whether anyone would question it." "And if they did?" Beatrice's gaze returned. "Then they might begin to question other things." Miss Marple regarded her steadily. "Yes," she said, "they might." There was a long pause. Then Miss Marple added very quietly, "You believe something is wrong." Beatrice did not answer at once. When she did, her voice was almost inaudible. "Yes." Miss Marple nodded. "So do I." Another silence. Then Miss Marple said, "Thank you." She turned to go. "Miss Marple?" Miss Marple paused at the door. "Yes?" Beatrice hesitated, then said, "Time can be altered." "Yes." "But people—" She stopped. Miss Marple waited. "They are harder to change," Beatrice finished. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes," she said, "much harder." She left the shop and stepped back into the afternoon light. The village moved as it always did, quietly, predictably. A woman crossed the street with a basket. A cart rolled past. Somewhere a door closed. Everything appeared the same, and yet, Miss Marple thought, it was not. She turned her steps toward the vicarage. Dr. Stephen Hale was in the garden when she arrived, speaking with the vicar's wife. He excused himself at once when he saw her. "Miss Marple? I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all." They walked a little way down the path together. "You have been to the shop," he said. "Yes." "And?" Miss Marple looked at him. "Miss Lyle is a very observant young woman." He smiled faintly. "She is that. And she has chosen not to correct the clocks." His expression changed. "I see." "You do?" "Yes," he said slowly. "I think I do." Miss Marple watched him. "You were at Ivy Bank yesterday," she said. "Yes." "At what time?" "A few minutes after 5. "And you left?" "At 5:30. "Exactly." He hesitated. "Approximately." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course." They walked on. "Dr. Hale," she said after a moment, "do you believe Mr. Pennington died at 6:15? He frowned. "That is the time given." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "But do you believe it?" He did not answer immediately. "No," he said at last. "I am no longer certain." Miss Marple nodded. "Nor am I." They reached the gate. "There is one thing more," Dr. Hale said. "Yes?" "The tonic." Miss Marple turned. "What of it?" "I examined the glass," he said. "There was a trace of something." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "What sort of something?" "I cannot say for certain, not yet. But it was not what one would expect." Miss Marple was very still. "Poison?" she said softly. "Possibly." A silence fell between them. At last Miss Marple said, "Then we must consider not only when Mr. Pennington died, but how." "Yes," said Dr. Hale. "And," Miss Marple added, "why the time was arranged as it was." She turned to go. "Miss Marple," she looked back. "If it is murder," Miss Marple's expression was calm. "Yes." "Who could have done it?" Miss Marple considered. Then she said very gently, "Someone who understands time." She walked away, leaving him standing at the gate. Behind her, the village continued its quiet, ordered life. But Miss Marple knew now, quite certainly, that beneath that order lay something far less predictable. Because somewhere, in those carefully measured minutes, a life had ended, and someone had made very sure that it appeared to happen exactly on time. By the following morning, Larkspur Hollow had settled into a new rhythm, one that was outwardly unchanged, yet subtly altered beneath the surface. It is often the way, Miss Marple reflected, that a disturbance does not immediately disrupt a place. Instead, it rearranges it quietly. Like a hand shifting pieces on a chessboard while the players are still studying their moves. At Ivy Bank the routine continued. Breakfast was laid at the usual hour. The hall clock chimed as it always had. The garden path remained perfectly swept. Only the absence of Alfred Pennington gave the impression, faint but unmistakable, that something essential had been removed. Miss Marple arrived shortly after 10. Harriet received her with the same composed manner, though there were signs now of strain, faint shadows beneath her eyes, a slight tightening at the corners of her mouth. "I hope you do not mind my coming again," Miss Marple said. "Not at all," Harriet replied. "In fact, I am glad of it." "That is kind of you," Harriet hesitated, then added, "There is something I should like to show you." She led Miss Marple upstairs. The bedroom of the late Mr. Pennington was as orderly as his study. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn back to admit the pale morning light. On the mantel stood a small clock, plain, functional, and as Harriet had mentioned, slightly slow. "I checked it again this morning," Harriet said. It is still 2 minutes behind." Miss Marple nodded. "And you are certain it was not so before?" "Quite certain." Miss Marple moved closer, studying the clock without touching it. "Miss Lyle attends to this one as well?" "Yes." "And she's not been here since—" "Not since yesterday morning." Miss Marple turned. "Before or after the discovery?" "Before," Harriet said. "She came early. I sent for her to look at the clocks, though I did not then understand why they troubled me." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened very slightly. "You noticed something was wrong before your uncle was found?" Harriet paused. "Yes," she said slowly. "I suppose I did." "In what way?" "The study clock seemed too quick, and the bedroom clock too slow. It unsettled me." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes," she said. "I can understand that." They returned downstairs in silence. In the hall, Leonard Pennington stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, looking out toward the garden. He turned as they entered. "Miss Marple," he said lightly. "Back again. You must find us quite fascinating." Miss Marple smiled. "I find people fascinating," she said. "Houses merely reflect them." Leonard laughed softly. "That is a dangerous philosophy." "Is it?" "For those who have something to reflect," he said. Harriet gave him a sharp look. Leonard— "Oh, come," he said. "We're all thinking it. If not saying it. Uncle dies at exactly the right time. The clocks disagree with one another, and the entire village begins to whisper." Miss Marple regarded him. "You are not whispering," she observed. "No," he said. "I prefer clarity." "And what is it you are clear about?" Leonard hesitated, then shrugged. "That something is wrong." Miss Marple's eyes rested on him. "Yes," she said quietly. "I believe you're right." He seemed slightly taken aback by her agreement. "Well," he said, "that is refreshing." Harriet spoke again, her tone firm. "This is not the time for speculation." "No," Leonard replied. "It is precisely the time for it." Miss Marple intervened gently. "My dear Miss Harriet," she said, "your nephew is not entirely mistaken. When something appears unusual—" "It is only natural to seek an explanation." Harriet pressed her lips together. "I would prefer," she said, "that any explanation be based on fact." "As would I," said Miss Marple. She turned to Leonard. "You were present yesterday afternoon?" "Yes." "At what time did you arrive?" Leonard considered. "A little after 4, I suppose." "And you remained?" "Until— perhaps 5. Did you go into the study?" "No." "Are you certain?" He smiled faintly. "Quite certain. Uncle preferred to receive me in the drawing room. Less risk of disorder, you see." Miss Marple nodded. "And did you notice anything unusual?" Leonard's expression shifted slightly. "The atmosphere," he said, "if that counts." "In what way?" "It felt—" He paused, searching for the word. "Tight, as though something were about to happen." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "Yes," she said. "That is often the case." Harriet moved toward the table. "Leonard, please," she said quietly. "This is not helpful." "No," he said. "It is not, but it is true." Miss Marple let the matter rest. After a moment she said, "Miss Harriet, may I ask, who prepared your uncle's tonic yesterday?" Harriet frowned slightly. "Emily did, as usual." "And the bottle?" "In the sideboard in the dining room." "May I see it?" Harriet hesitated only briefly. "Of course." She led Miss Marple into the dining room where the sideboard stood against the wall, its contents arranged with the same careful precision as everything else in the house. The bottle stood near the back, half full, its label neat and unremarkable. Miss Marple picked it up, turning it slightly in her hand. "Has it been used since yesterday?" "No." Miss Marple replaced it exactly where it had been. "Thank you." They returned to the hall. At that moment the front door opened and Beatrice Lyle entered. She paused when she saw Miss Marple, Harriet and Leonard gathered together. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. "Not at all," Harriet replied. "I sent for you." Beatrice inclined her head. "The clocks?" "Yes." Beatrice stepped forward, her gaze moving briefly from one face to another before settling almost instinctively on Miss Marple. "You have noticed," she said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. Beatrice nodded, as though confirming something to herself. "I thought you might." She moved to the hall clock, opening its glass case with practiced ease. Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You have adjusted them," she said. Beatrice did not look up. "Not yes." "Why?" Beatrice's hands paused. "Because they were wrong." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. In what way? Beatrice closed the case. They did not agree? Miss Marple smiled faintly. And now they do? Yes. All of them? Yes. Miss Marple's gaze did not leave her. And which one, she asked softly, is correct? For a moment Beatrice did not answer. Then she said, the one that tells the truth. A silence followed. Leonard gave a short laugh. That is delightfully mysterious. Beatrice ignored him. Miss Marple inclined her head. Yes, she said. I thought as much. Harriet looked from one to the other. I do not understand any of this, she said. Miss Marple turned to her. My dear Miss Harriet, she said gently, understanding rarely comes all at once. It is usually a matter of adjustment. She glanced briefly at the clock. Like time. Beatrice's eyes met hers. Yes, she said quietly. Exactly like time. Miss Marple smiled, and in that moment she knew, though she did not yet say it, that the pattern was nearly complete. Only one or two small threads remained, and when they were drawn together, the truth, like the striking of a clock, would be unmistakable. The inquest was held the following afternoon in the small parish hall, a long, low room that usually hosted jumble sales, flower committees, and the occasional earnest lecture on soil improvement. On this occasion, it had been arranged with rows of chairs, a central table, and a seriousness that did not quite belong to it. Miss Marple arrived with Mrs. Fanshawe a few minutes early. It is most uncomfortable, Eleanor whispered, unsettling herself with unnecessary care. One feels as though one ought to have brought a hat suitable for tragedy. Miss Marple smiled faintly. In my experience, she said, tragedy does not concern itself with hats. The villagers gathered quietly. Conversations were subdued. Even those who had come primarily from curiosity seemed aware that something about this event was not entirely ordinary. At the front, the coroner sat with a composed, official manner. Beside him, Constable Briggs shuffled his notes with determined seriousness. Dr. Hale stood near the side table, his expression grave. Harriet Pennington entered shortly afterward, dressed in black, her composure intact though her face was pale. Leonard followed, less formal but unusually subdued. Beatrice Lyle came last. She took a seat near the back. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze lowered, not in avoidance but in thought. Miss Marple noticed that she did not once look toward Dr. Hale. The proceedings began. Formalities were observed, names were recorded. The quiet machinery of inquiry set itself in motion. Dr. Hale was called first. He spoke clearly, his voice steady, though Miss Marple detected the faintest undercurrent of hesitation beneath it. The deceased, Mr. Alfred Pennington, he said, was found in his study at approximately 6:15 in the evening. He was seated in his chair. There were no signs of disturbance. And the cause of death? Asked the coroner. A cardiac event, Dr. Hale replied. However, he paused. Yes, said the coroner. There was evidence, Dr. Hale continued carefully, of a foreign substance in the tonic glass found on the desk. A murmur passed through the room. Mrs. Fanshawe gripped Miss Marple's arm. I knew it, she whispered. Miss Marple did not respond. What kind of substance? The coroner asked. A toxin, Dr. Hale said. Mild, but sufficient in the quantity present to cause collapse. Then you are suggesting, I am suggesting, Dr. Hale said, that the death may not have been entirely natural. The murmur deepened. Harriet sat very still. Leonard shifted slightly in his chair, his expression tightening. Beatrice did not move at all. The coroner nodded. Thank you, Doctor. Emily, the parlour-maid, was called next. She stepped forward hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly together. You served Mr. Pennington his tonic yesterday afternoon? The coroner asked. Yes. Sir? At what time? 5:30, sir. And you are certain of that? Yes, sir. Did you notice anything unusual? Emily swallowed. No, sir. Miss Marple, watching her, knew at once that this was not entirely true, but the girl said no more. Harriet was called. She spoke with clarity and control. I went to the study at 6:15 to call my uncle for dinner, she said. I had just checked the hall clock. And what did you find? He was seated in his chair. He did not respond. I realized at once that something was wrong. Did you touch anything? No. Did you notice the time on the study clock? Yes. It also read 6:15. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. The The coroner made a note. Leonard was called next. He approached with an ease that might, in another setting, have seemed careless. You were present at Ivy Bank yesterday afternoon? Yes. At what time did you leave? A little before 5. Did you see your uncle afterward? No. Did you notice anything unusual? Leonard hesitated. Only that he seemed preoccupied. In what way? I cannot say. The coroner regarded him for a moment, then nodded. You may sit down. Finally, Beatrice Lyle was called. She rose quietly and took her place. You are responsible for maintaining the clocks at Ivy Bank? The coroner asked. Yes. Were they in order yesterday? Beatrice paused. No, she said. A stir ran through the room. In what way? They did not agree. Which clock was correct? Beatrice looked up. The one that was not changed, she said. The coroner frowned slightly. I do not follow. Beatrice did not elaborate. Miss Marple, however, smiled faintly. Did you adjust the clocks? The coroner asked. Yes. When? This morning. Why not yesterday? Beatrice's voice was calm. Because I wished to see whether anyone would notice the difference. And did they? Beatrice glanced, just briefly, toward Miss Marple. Yes. The coroner cleared his throat. Thank you, Miss Lyle. He turned to his notes. In light of the evidence, he said, it is clear that Mr. Pennington did not die of natural causes. The presence of a toxin indicates that his death was assisted. A murmur rose again. Mrs. Fanshawe closed her eyes briefly. This is dreadful, she whispered. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. It is. The coroner continued. The exact time of death remains uncertain, given the discrepancy between the clocks. However, it is believed to have occurred between 5:45 and 6:15. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her gloves. 5:45. That was earlier than Harriet had stated, earlier than the assumed time, earlier than... Her thoughts aligned, quietly, with a precision that felt almost inevitable. The coroner concluded. A verdict of unlawful death, he said, pending further investigation. The room slowly emptied. Voices rose again, low, urgent, speculative. Miss Marple remained seated for a moment. Mrs. Fanshawe turned to her. Well, she said. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked across the room. Dr. Hale stood near the door, speaking with Constable Briggs. Harriet was surrounded by 2 village women, her expression composed but distant. Leonard had already slipped outside. And Beatrice? Beatrice stood alone. Her gaze met Miss Marple's. There was no triumph in it, no fear, only a quiet certainty. Miss Marple rose. My dear Eleanor, she said gently, I believe we shall soon have the answer. Mrs. Fanshawe stared at her. You know, she said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I believe I do. Outside, the afternoon light had begun to fade. The village resumed its movements, though with a sharper edge now, like a clock that ticks just a little too loudly. Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the cottage. Jane, said Mrs. Fanshawe, you must tell me. Miss Marple glanced at her. In a moment, she said. Not quite yet. They reached the gate. Miss Marple paused. 3 minutes, she said softly. Mrs. Fanshawe looked puzzled. What about them? Miss Marple's eyes rested on the distant outline of Ivy Bank. 3 minutes, she repeated, is just enough time to be somewhere else. Mrs. Fanshawe blinked. I do not understand at all. Miss Marple smiled. No, she said, but you will. She opened the gate. Because, she added quietly, someone has used those 3 minutes to create an alibi, and now she knew who. That evening Miss Marple did not at once explain herself. Mrs. Fanshawe, who had followed her home in a state of mounting impatience, endured a silence that she found almost unbearable. Supper was taken, plates cleared, and still Miss Marple said nothing of consequence. She seemed, if anything, more occupied with small details than usual, straightening a folded napkin, adjusting the position of the salt, winding the clock with careful attention. At last, when the clock struck 8, Mrs. Fanshawe could bear it no longer. Jane, she said firmly, you know something. Miss Marple looked up. Yes, she said. Well then. Miss Marple folded her hands. My dear Eleanor, there is a difference between knowing and proving. One must be quite certain of the second before one speaks of the first. Mrs. Fanshawe made an impatient sound. I do not see why one should not speak of both at once. Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is because you are not accustomed to being contradicted by facts. Before Mrs. Fanshawe could respond, there came a quiet knock at the door. It was Beatrice Lyle. She stood on the threshold, her face pale but composed. I hope I'm not intruding, she said. Not at all, Miss Marple replied. Do come in. Beatrice entered and took the chair Miss Marple indicated. For a moment no one spoke. Then Miss Marple said gently, You have come because you too have reached a conclusion. Beatrice's eyes lifted. Yes. Mrs. Fanshawe looked from one to the other. This is insufferable, she said. You're both speaking as though the matter were settled. In a sense, Miss Marple said quietly, it is. Beatrice's hands tightened slightly in her lap. I did not mean for it to go so far, she said. Miss Marple regarded her steadily. No, she said. I do not believe you did. Mrs. Fanshawe leaned forward. Will someone explain? Miss Marple inclined her head. Very well, she said. Let us begin with the clocks. She turned slightly toward Beatrice. You altered them this morning, she said, but they had already been altered before that. Yes, Beatrice replied. By whom? Beatrice hesitated. I am not certain, she said, but I know they were not as I left them. Miss Marple nodded. Quite so. She looked at Mrs. Fanshawe. The study clock was 3 minutes fast. The bedroom clock was slow. The hall clock remained correct. Yes, said Mrs. Fanshawe impatiently. We know all that, Miss Marple continued. Now consider this. Harriet Pennington states that she entered the study at 6:15, according to the hall clock. The study clock also read 6:15. Which suggests, Mrs. Fanshawe began. Which suggests, Miss Marple said gently, that the study clock had been adjusted to match the hall clock at that moment. Mrs. Fanshawe blinked. But you said it was fast. It was, Miss Marple replied, but only before. A silence fell. Beatrice spoke softly. Someone changed it after the death. Yes, said Miss Marple. Mrs. Fanshawe stared. After? But why? Miss Marple's voice was very calm. To fix the time, she paused. Because the real time of death was earlier. Mrs. Fanshawe's mouth opened slightly. How much earlier? Approximately 3 minutes, Miss Marple said. Beatrice nodded. That is what I thought. Miss Marple continued. Now, those 3 minutes are of great importance. They allow a person to be in one place when the death is discovered, and in another when it actually occurred. Mrs. Fanshawe sat back slowly. An alibi, she said. Yes. Miss Marple looked at Beatrice. You suspected as much. Yes. And you left the clocks uncorrected to see who would react. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. Very sensible. Mrs. Fanshawe turned to her. But who? Who could have done such a thing? Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she said, Let us consider the tonic. Beatrice's gaze sharpened. Yes. The poison was in the glass. That means it was introduced before Mr. Pennington drank it. Of course, said Mrs. Fanshawe. Emily brought the tray, Miss Marple continued, but there is no evidence she tampered with it. She was frightened, genuinely so. Beatrice nodded. Yes. Therefore, Miss Marple went on, the poison must have been added either before the tray reached the study or after. Mrs. Fanshawe frowned. But if it was after, then someone entered the study, Miss Marple said, between 5:30 and the time of death. Beatrice spoke quietly, and that someone would need to be trusted. Yes, Miss Marple folded her hands. Now, who had the opportunity? She began to count not on her fingers but in her mind. Harriet Pennington, Leonard Pennington, Doctor. Hale! Miss Lyle! Mrs. Fanshawe gave a small exclamation. You cannot mean... Miss Marple raised a hand. Let us not leap ahead. She turned again to Beatrice. You said earlier that people are harder to change than time. Yes. And yet, Miss Marple said softly, people may change under pressure. Beatrice's eyes lowered. Yes. Miss Marple's voice became even gentler. You were present yesterday afternoon. You left at 5:10. Yes. And you did not return. No. Miss Marple inclined her head. Then we may set you aside. Beatrice let out a quiet breath. Mrs. Fanshawe looked bewildered. Set her aside, just like that? Miss Marple smiled faintly. My dear Eleanor, one must begin somewhere. She turned her attention back to the problem. Leonard Pennington, she said. He left at 5. He's careless, but not precise. It is difficult to imagine him arranging such a delicate deception. Mrs. Fanshawe nodded. Yes, that seems likely. Which leaves... Miss Marple paused. Beatrice looked up. Yes, she said. Miss Marple met her gaze. Yes. A long silence followed. Mrs. Fanshawe leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. You mean Harriet? Miss Marple did not immediately confirm it. Instead, she said, Harriet Pennington is a woman of great capability. She manages the household with exactness. She understands her uncle's habits perfectly. She would know precisely when he took his tonic, when he retired to his study, and when he was likely to be undisturbed. Beatrice's hands tightened. Yes. And she was the one who found him, Miss Marple continued, at 6:15, according to the hall clock. Mrs. Fanshawe stared. But why? Miss Marple's expression softened. That, she said, is the question that remains. Beatrice spoke, her voice low. I think I know. Miss Marple looked at her. Yes? Beatrice hesitated. He was not kind, she said. Not really. He demanded everything. Precision, obedience, control. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes. And Harriet. She bore it. For years. Yes. Beatrice's voice trembled slightly. Until she could not. Mrs. Fanshawe pressed her hand to her mouth. This is dreadful. Yes, said Miss Marple, it is. She rose slowly. But it is not yet finished. Beatrice looked at her. What do you mean? Miss Marple's eyes were calm. I mean, she said, that understanding is not enough. She moved toward the door. One must also demonstrate. Mrs. Fanshawe blinked. Demonstrate? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, she opened the door. Because, she added quietly, in a matter of time, it is always best to show exactly how it was done. The following afternoon, Miss Marple requested that a small gathering be arranged at Ivy Bank. It was done with quiet efficiency. Harriet agreed at once, perhaps out of a sense of duty, perhaps because she had already begun to understand that something inevitable was approaching. Dr. Hale was invited. Constable Briggs came as a matter of course. Leonard arrived late, though not quite late enough to draw comment. Beatrice Lyle was there, standing near the window, her presence unobtrusive yet unmistakable. Mrs. Fanshawe took her seat with an air of determined anticipation. Miss Marple stood near the mantel. For a moment she said nothing. Her eyes moved across the room, not hurriedly, but with the same calm attention she'd shown from the beginning. Each face, each position, each small detail was taken in. Then she spoke. My dear friends, she said gently, we are here because something has occurred which does not fit comfortably with what we know of life in Larkspur Hollow. There was a slight shifting among the group. Mr. Alfred Pennington, she continued, lived by the clock. His habits were exact, his routines precise, and yet his death, though it appeared to follow those same patterns, does not in fact do so. Harriet sat very still. Miss Marple turned slightly toward the mantel clock. The time of death was given as 6:15, she said. This was based on the clocks in the house, most particularly the study clock, she paused. But the study clock was not correct. Dr. Hale nodded faintly. We have established that it was 3 minutes fast. Yes, said Miss Marple, and that is the key to everything. She moved a little closer to the desk. Mr. Pennington was last seen alive at 5:40. He returned to his study shortly thereafter. His tonic, into which the poison had been introduced, was taken at approximately 5:30. She let the facts settle. The poison acted quickly. It would have caused collapse within a few minutes. Constable Briggs cleared his throat. Then he died. Before 6:15. Precisely, said Miss Marple. He died at approximately 6:12, or earlier. A silence fell. Mrs. Fanshawe drew in a breath. Then the time was altered. Yes, said Miss Marple, it was. She turned. Now let us consider who could have done this. Her gaze moved from one face to another. Someone who knew Mr. Pennington's habits. Someone who had access to the study. Someone who understood the significance of time. Her eyes came to rest on Harriet. Someone who would know exactly when to enter the room, and exactly what the clock should say. Harriet did not move. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "You entered the study at 6:15, she said. "But by that time your uncle had already been dead for several minutes." Harriet's hands tightened slightly in her lap. "You adjusted the study clock," Miss Marple continued softly, "so that it matched the hall clock at that moment. In doing so, you fixed the time of death." Dr. Hale looked at Harriet, his expression troubled. "Is that true?" Harriet did not answer. Miss Marple went on. "You had the opportunity," she said. "You prepared the household arrangements. You knew when the tonic would be taken, and you had the skill and the presence of mind to alter the clock afterward." Constable Briggs shifted his weight. "And the poison?" he asked. Miss Marple inclined her head. "That was introduced before the tonic reached the study," she said. "It could have been added in the dining room where the bottle was kept." All eyes turned to Harriet. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady. "Yes," she said. The word fell into the room with quiet finality. Mrs. Fanshawe gave a small cry. Dr. Hale stepped forward. "Harriet," she raised a hand. "Please," she said. "Do not." She looked at Miss Marple. "You're quite right," she said. "About all of it." Miss Marple did not reply. Harriet continued. "I added the poison to the tonic," she said, "before Emily took it in. I knew he would drink it at once, he always did," her voice did not tremble. "And when he died, I waited." "A few minutes," Miss Marple said gently. "Yes." "And then you went to the study." "Yes." "And adjusted the clock." Harriet inclined her head. "Yes." Constable Briggs took a step forward. "But why?" he said. "Why do such a thing?" Harriet's gaze moved slowly around the room. For the first time there was something in it. Something beyond control. "Because," she said, "he controlled everything." No one spoke. "For years," she went on, "every moment of every day was dictated, every action measured, every mistake noted, every failure remembered." Her hands tightened. "He did not strike," she said. "He did not shout. He did not need to. His disapproval was sufficient." Beatrice lowered her eyes. Harriet continued. "I arranged the house. I kept the time. I made everything correct." A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "I became what he required." Dr. Hale spoke quietly. "But that is no reason." "No," she said. "It is not." She met his gaze. "But it is an explanation." A long silence followed. At last Miss Marple spoke. "You chose the time very carefully," she said. "Yes," Harriet replied, "because you knew it would appear natural." "Yes." "And you adjusted the clock to ensure it." "Yes." Miss Marple inclined her head. "A perfectly timed murder," she said softly. Harriet gave a small, almost weary smile. "Yes," she said. "That is what I thought." Constable Briggs stepped forward again. "I'm afraid I must ask you to come with me, Miss Pennington." Harriet rose. She did not resist. As she moved toward the door, she paused. "Miss Marple," she said. Yes?" "You noticed the clocks?" "Yes," Harriet nodded. "I should have known." Miss Marple's expression was gentle. "My dear Miss Harriet," she said, "it is often the smallest things that reveal the truth." Harriet inclined her head. Then she went out. The room remained silent. At last Mrs. Fanshawe spoke. "Well," she said faintly, "I never liked her." Miss Marple did not respond. Instead, she looked at the clock on the mantel. It ticked steadily, accurately, and now, truthfully. The village of Larkspur Hollow returned in time to its habits. It is one of the peculiar strengths of such places that they absorb disturbance without appearing to change. The hedges were trimmed. The post office closed for luncheon at precisely the same hour. The church bell rang with its usual authority, here as though no human error had ever occurred beneath its steady toll. And yet, something had altered. Not in any way that could be easily pointed to. No window remained broken, no door stood ajar. But the silence, Miss Marple thought, was no longer quite so unquestioned. People noticed things now. A clock that ran too fast, a delay that had no explanation, a glance that lingered just a moment longer than it should. Miss Marple sat, as she often did, by the window of Mrs. Fanshawe's sitting room, her knitting resting quietly in her lap. Outside, the late afternoon light fell across the lane, soft and unassuming. Mrs. Fanshawe, opposite her, had just concluded a firm and rather lengthy opinion regarding the dangers of excessive punctuality. "I have always said," she declared, "that moderation is the key to everything. A little order is admirable, too much of it, well, one sees the result." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes," she said, "one does." There was a pause. "And Harriet," Mrs. Fanshawe went on, lowering her voice slightly, "she always seemed so capable. So correct. Yes. I cannot understand it." Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "My dear Eleanor," she said gently, "there are many things in life that cannot be understood all at once." Mrs. Fanshawe frowned. "But surely one must try." "Oh, one does," said Miss Marple. "But understanding people is not like solving a sum. There is rarely a single answer." She looked out of the window again. "Harriet Pennington lived for many years under a very particular kind of control," she said. "Not harsh in the obvious sense, but constant, unyielding, every moment accounted for, every action measured." Mrs. Fanshawe gave a small reluctant nod. "Yes, I suppose that is true." "And such control," Miss Marple continued softly, "can do curious things to the mind. It does not always break a person. Sometimes it shapes them into something very exact." "Too exact," Mrs. Fanshawe murmured. "Yes." There was another silence. "And the others?" Mrs. Fanshawe asked after a moment. "Dr. Hale? That girl? Miss Lyle? The nephew?" Miss Marple considered. "Dr. Hale," she said, "will recover. He has a sensible nature, though perhaps not always a sufficiently suspicious one. He will be more careful in future. And Miss Lyle?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "She understands time," she said. "And now, perhaps, she understands people a little better as well." Mrs. Fanshawe sniffed. "I found her rather unsettling." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "People who observe closely often are. And Leonard?" Miss Marple allowed herself the faintest smile. "Leonard will continue as he always has, careless, charming, and just a little more cautious than before." Mrs. Fanshawe sighed. "Well, I am glad it is all over." Miss Marple did not immediately reply. After a moment she said, "Is it?" Mrs. Fanshawe looked at her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple rose and crossed to the mantel. The small clock there ticked quietly, its hands moving with measured certainty. "Events," she said, "may come to an end, but their effects remain." She adjusted the clock very slightly. "Time," she went on, "has a way of carrying things forward, even those we might prefer to leave behind." Mrs. Fanshawe shivered faintly. "You make it sound rather ominous." Miss Marple smiled. "Not ominous," she said. "Only true." She returned to her chair. Outside, a figure passed along the lane, a woman carrying a basket, her steps even, her path familiar. A cart followed, its wheels turning in steady rhythm. Life continued, as it always did, and yet Miss Marple thought there would be moments, small, almost imperceptible, when someone in Larkspur Hollow would pause. They would look at a clock, they would notice its hands, and they would remember. That time, though measured so carefully, could also be used. Miss Marple took up her knitting once more. Her needles moved with quiet precision, each stitch placed exactly where it should be. There was comfort in that, order even, but she knew, better than most, that no pattern was ever entirely without flaw. And sometimes, it was the smallest flaw of all, a difference of 3 minutes, that revealed everything.